Alright guys, now we're going to talk about plant tissues. Alright, so these are all going to be the components of plants, kind of little pieces of plants, and we'll have a lot that we're going to add on to this because this is going to be a pretty big section as far as information goes. There's a lot of it that's going to be on your quiz and on the test out of this section. Let's see, so for as far as the components of the plant body, you have two different parts. You have the shoots and you got the roots. Alright, the shoots are everything above the ground, which includes the stems, the leaves, and the flowers. And then the roots are everything below the ground that help to anchor, that store energy, that release food, all that kind of good stuff. Alright, so we got our two components of plants in general. And we have something called meristems, which are the area where the growth occurs. All right, meristems are the sections with the growth. And we have the apical meristem, which is the primary source of growth, which help to lengthen the shoots and the roots. So they make the plant grow taller or the roots grow deeper, that kind of thing. And then we have our lateral meristems. The lateral meristems are the secondary growth, and they basically help thicken the roots and the shoots. All right, so the apical meristems lengthen the roots and the shoots, and the lateral meristems thicken the roots and shoots. And that will be on your quiz. Right, we also have three different types of tissues, and these will be on your quiz. Right, so you need to know the ground tissue, the vascular tissue, and the dermal tissue. The ground tissue is responsible for photosynthesis and food storage. The vascular tissue is responsible for moving water and solutes. And then the dermal tissue helps to cover and protect the plant. All right, so you got those three types of tissues found within plants, and you will need to know those. I'm going to ask you about one of them. And with those tissues, we have two different types. We have simple tissues and we have complex tissues. All right, and so simple tissues are made up of only one cell type, so they're all composed of the same exact type of cell. And there are three types of simple tissues. You have the parenchyma, the parenchyma, and the sclerenchyma. You need to know these three types. So you need to know each one of these three, and that they're simple tissues and what they do, which we'll talk about in a second. And then there's the complex tissues. Complex tissues are made up of two or more types of cells, and this is like your xylem and your phloem and your vascular tissue. So xylem and phloem are both made out of several different types of several different cell types, and are considered to be a complex tissue. Monocots versus dicots. All right, so monocot versus dicot, you're going to need to make sure you know the difference between those two. So monocots have the one cotyledon, like we talked about, and the dicots have the two cotyledons. We also talked about how the veins are different. So the monocots have parallel veins, whereas the dicots have branching veins. And then we have some other differences that I have up on here. Flower parts, you can have the dicots have multiples of 4 or 5 for their flower parts, whereas monocots have multiples of 3. The pollen grains, the dicots have 3 pores, whereas the monocots only have 1 pore. And then for that ground tissue, the vascular bundles, it's either the vascular bundles, the xylem and phloem are organized, or in the dicots, or they're completely distributed throughout the entire root shoot, like in the monocots. So it could be either any one of those. All right. One thing I didn't say is you need to know that parenchyma, parenchyma, and sclerenchyma are all types of simple tissues. So make sure you know those. All right. I just want to make sure I clarified that. All right. So for that parenchyma, parenchyma, and sclerenchyma, parenchyma makes up most of the soft, moist primary growth of the roots and shoots. So it's all the part that you typically see where you have lots of soft growth, not the hard wooden part. All right. But all the other tips of the rest of the plant. They also help with repair, they help with gas exchange, and they help with storage. Parenchyma is a stretchable type of tissue, kind of like collagen in animals. Right? It helps support new growth, helps provide protection, support, strength, and allows them to also to be bendable, though, so that they don't snap and break. And then sclerenchyma is dead at maturity, and it's hardened with lignin, and this is basically your wood. So this makes up the dense, hard part of your simple tissues that provides the dense, non-stretchable, not elastic growth. For our complex tissues, you got your vascular tissue, which is our xylem and phloem that we've talked about, and our dermal tissue, like our epidermis and our stoma. All right, so our epidermis being that cuticle around the outside, our stomata have the guard cells and all the other things that are components of those. So all of those are complex tissues. For the shoot structure, so the part above the ground, you have terminal buds and you have lateral buds. All right, terminal buds are at the very end of the primary growth, so the shoot's main zone of primary growth are at the very end of the branches. They elongate those branches along with the length of that branch. Whereas lateral buds are dormant shoots of mostly meristematic tissue, so of reproductive tissue, of growth tissue, but they're designed to grow out sideways in case something happens to that terminal bud. So typically the terminal bud continues on that shoot, and then the lateral buds are are brought in whenever that terminal bud gets damaged and it's no longer to continue in that direction. So this is where pruning comes in handy. So whenever you prune a plant, you take off that terminal bud and cause those lateral buds to grow out, making the plant look a lot bushier and maintain a smaller size. And so there's an example. You got your terminal bud or apical meristem at the tip, and then your auxiliary buds or lateral buds along the sides there that are able to grow if that terminal bud actually gets damaged and the branch is no longer able to extend. Inside the stem, you have vascular bundles, which are like ring-like arrays of and dicots are distributed. Basically, it's where you keep the xylem and phloem. So inside the stem of a dicot, it's in a ring. Inside of the monocots, it's just willy-nilly wherever inside of it. And the cortex is a portion of the dicots between the vascular tissue and the epidermis. So it's that layer or that area between that xylem and phloem and between the actual outside covering or the epidermis. And the very center or inside part of the dicots is called the pith. And that's inside that vascular tissue. And that's the area that tends to harden and helps provide a lot of support. Kind of like the backbone of a vertebrate. The pith is kind of the backbone of the plant. And there's nice little pictures. You can see the rings on the dicot on the right, or you can see spread out all over the place on the monocot on the left. Right, as far as leaves go, you have a blade of the leaf, and you have the petiole, which is kind of like the little stem. And leaves come in simple or compound. The epidermis has that cuticle that waxy cuticle that gets excreted and helps make those little stomata, those mouths that help open and close the plant, allowing the gas to move in and out of the leaf. You have the mesophyll cells that are tall columnar cells that are packed full of chloroplasts to help with photosynthesis. And you have those veins. Those veins can either be branching or parallel depending on if you're talking about dicot or monocot. And there's a nice little cross-section picture. You can see the mesophyll cells, the columnar cells to help trap all the light. You can see the cuticle getting created by the epidermis. You can see all the space in there to allow the oxygen to flow out and the carbon dioxide to flow in and the water to get transported to all the tissues, all that good stuff. For root structures have something called little root hairs. And basically they're teeny tiny little structures coming off the roots that help to increase the surface area for absorption. So this helps make the root more efficient at absorbing when it has these root hairs. You also have the vascular cylinder, which is in the very center of the root where the water gets absorbed up and the phloem comes down. So it's right in the middle of the root. And then you have the endodermis, which is a waterproof layer to help prevent water from coming into the root where it's not expected, to keep the root from rotting and things along those lines. You have two different types of roots. You have tap roots, which are more typically found in dicots, like think of a carrot whenever you think of a tap root. And then you have fibrous roots, which are typically found in monocots. So fibrous roots are like those underneath of a onion or a grass root. All right, so all those are fibrous roots. Little hairs, and there's your tap root on the left and your fibrous root on the right. Woody plants add secondary growth in 2 or more growing seasons. So they have 2 kind of seasons of growing. They have a primary, or they have a light wood and a dark wood season. All right, the light wood is your main growth, which happens in the springtime, and the dark wood is your slower growth that typically happens in the summertime when it's a lot hotter and they're not able to grow quite as fast. Some monocots, almost all dicots, and gymnosperms, and all magnolias are in this category of woody plants that produce wood at their core. When we talk about bark, you have the periderm, which is like the cork cambium, the cork part all around the outside. You have the vascular cambium, which is underneath of that helps to make the xylem. It makes and the phloem. It makes the xylem to the inside of the vascular cambium and the phloem to the outside. So it's this ring that produces this vascular tissue. And it makes all the xylem just inside of that ring and all the phloem to the outside of that ring. And then as the plant grows, that cambium moves out. It creates more xylem on the inside, pushing out the old phloem and creating a new phloem underneath of that. And that old phloem ends up becoming part of that bark also. And then you have the cork cambium, which is just outside of that. It helps to make the cork and helps to insulate and basically waterproof the roots and the shoot surfaces and basically help to make the bark. So you got a nice little picture here. It kind of shows that whole process. You're going to have a short answer question that involves the production of bark, right? And so the production of wood and bark, right? So the thing that I want you to remember is that early wood is the spring growth. So when you have the most growth around the plant, so that's a light colored wood. When you're looking at the rings around a tree, the light ring is the early wood. That's the growth that happens in the springtime, and then the late wood is the dark ring, and that's the growth that happens in the summertime. Summer tends to be a lot more hot, a lot drier, and so you get a lot less growth, and so it's much more compact, making it look much darker. So this is why you have the light, dark ring pattern that you have in tree wood. When I was growing up, they told me the light was in the summertime and the dark was in wintertime. But if you think about it, wintertime they're not growing at all, right? So there is no leaves, there is no growth whatsoever, so there is no dark ring, right? So the light ring is the spring growth, the early wood, and the late wood is the dark ring, which is your summer growth, right? And then they lose all their leaves and stop growing. And in order to create that wood, you have that vascular cambium that we were talking about that produces a xylem to the inside and a phloem to the outside. And that xylem, as it gets older and as it loses its abilities, it becomes the wood. Right? And that xylem gets filled with a component called lignin, Lignin. All right, and that lignin ends up making the different types of wood, the amount of lignin that's found inside of them. So heartwood typically has lots of lignin inside of it, making it very dry, very tough. Sapwood tends to be the part on the outside, the lighter color wood that tends to have a little bit less lignin. We talked about the growth rings being that early wood versus a late wood. And hardwoods tend to have more of that lignin inside of that xylem, whereas the softwoods tend not to. All right, so the softwoods like pine trees don't have as much lignin or any, whereas the hardwoods like your oaks, your hickories, your maples, they'll have lots of lignin, which make them much denser, make them much harder, and much better for using things that take a lot of wear and tear, like floors and furniture. All right. So if I were to ask you a question about how wood gets created, you're going to tell me something about early wood being spring growth, late wood being summer growth, that the vascular cambium produces a xylem to the inside and the phloem to the outside, and the xylem ends up making the wood, and eventually over time gets filled with lignin, creating the hardwood, or creating the hardwood. Okay? All right. So that is it for our plant tissues. All right, so take a look over it. Make sure you understand it. If you have any questions, please send me an email or talk to me.